The 7 Yards of Sorrow is a collection of interrelated poems. I'm having some guest readers help me tonight because it's sort of like a poetical play, and you'll hear, can't read the whole book, we're going to go through the strains. This whole project started from a lawsuit where two families were fighting over a gravesite. And I got to go to the Old City Cemetery in Galveston and learn about the cemetery, took photos of the particular gravesite and started noticing these incredible monuments and statues and some of these gravestones where people had been born in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 20th century. And in 21st, well, some few, they were buried recently. They're still burying people there. And what I learned about it, saw the names and I saw the names on the stones. And as I went through it, I realized that these names, some of them were very historical figures. The signer of one of the guys who actually wrote, supposedly, the Declaration of Independence, a guy named George Childers, Civil War generals, as well as their stones with the names are gone. And they do have records of the people. And I'm going to start, and the way we'll do this is I'll be reading, I'll point to some people, they'll come up and read. We're going to read it sort of straight through, and you'll hear the titles of the poems with no explanation of the poem in advance, because the story of the ghost, and these are ghost stories, will tell you. The stories are based on his history as well as historical fiction, a little poetic license. We're allowed to do that if we're poets as we go through it. So, as we go through the 7 Yards of Sorrow. In 1839, the city of Galveston had a problem with burial. They were normally burying people out in the sands of the beach, which you can imagine. And what would happen, as you can guess, high tides would come in or a storm would come in, wash out the graves and wash out the people, and they'd have their family come back to visit them. Not quite palatable, so they went to the farthest edges of town, they thought, and they dedicated these blocks, 6 small blocks. And the farthest city edge of town was 43rd through 48th Street. And those of you who know Galveston know there's an 80th Street, and know that on the Broadway where this cemetery is located, it goes all the way to 61st Street and beyond. So as the city grew, in some ways the cemetery shrunk, because within these little grounds were the main area where they put people. 10,000 souls were buried in this little cemetery of 6 small city blocks in 3 layers. Before 1900, there was the first layer. If you go out there, you'll see a lot of broken stones, and you'll see monuments, some of which are barely sticking out of the ground. And those go back to the 1900s, because when the storm hit Galveston, the 1900 storm, they built it up 6 to 9 feet in places, and so the cemetery was covered. And being very utilitarian, well, you now had a lot of open spaces because you had 6 to 9 feet extra dirt. So there's another layer of folks that were put there. In all, there's 7 yards that were buried. Presbyterian yard, the Hebrew, the Oleander yard, which was the potter's field, pauper's field, where those who had no money were buried. As they went through it in the 1930s, another fill, the potter's field, was filled in. So all the people who were there believing that they were getting their final rest were suddenly discarded and the dirt dumped on them. And a small handful, the gravestones were brought up on a few. You had to have a family member remember you in order for that gravestone to come up. And so they began to sell more. So there's 3 layers of people buried there. And there's people tell ghost stories, and you'll hear a couple of them that are based on history. And in the book itself, there's a number of them that have historical basis. And this is a story of an interplay of the caretaker, who was apparently, what I read of, a wonderful African-American gentleman who wasn't allowed to be buried there because of the color of his skin, even though for 65 years or more, he took care of the people there. And he is the caretaker character in this book. You'll also hear the stories of the stone angels themselves, because if you look at them, they're almost lifelike, and you hear that perhaps there's a little bit more to them than when you walk through there. And then, of course, with all the different inhabitants. Now, as a warning, I have to do trigger warnings. Nobody goes into a place like that happily. So none of these people are going to necessarily be happy. These are the stories of what happened to them. rough life. Very rough on women too. And so the extent you hear things about the women characters, it isn't disparaging. It is to reflect and show you what happened back then and how rough it is. And you hear the words and the voices of the people that were there. So what I'm going to do is we're going to read straight through. You'll hear the titles. And the titles are based upon who the poem is about. And some of them are choruses of people, which I can't do a chorus, but I'll do it myself. And with each one, there's a corresponding photograph that's in the book that will go through it. Chorus of the Lost 2. Weeping woman of the stone lepers, you cry for souls long lost. I have no solace for your grief. You were never flesh. You never had breath, felt pain, loved, died, yet you judge us, tears and stains formed by rain. We are the stone souls, lost in this yard. We are the dead walking, seeking, the living who wail so loudly, the living who wail so loudly in mock mourning and contrition as they go back to sleep in their beds. We once shared, ignore us, leaving nothing, tokens of petals that fade with the light of day. Weep no more, stone virgins. You have never lost what we have. Frozen in your gaze, you do not walk in the shadows of the light as we now must. The caretaker. The caretaker makes his rounds. 67 years he walked alone in the yards, chased blackbirds from nestling in cracks, yelled at stones to stay in their places, whispered to the angels, one hand that fondled their cheeks. Be my beloved, he whispered to them. The stones sighed in return. 67 years he walked, moving the shadows from one side of the sun to the other, coaxing the playful forms of those who passed as children to keep near their beds. If they wander too far, he knows they will dissipate in the light. 67 years he coddled those who linger, whose place has not been found. So they pace the fence line, longing to smell even the ragweed growing on the outer edge. 67 years caring in this place that would not accept him, that will not let him rest, because the skin that would fall away was not bleached like the bones of those he cared for. But after 67 years, even the most ardent cannot chase away the eternity he spends, letting them know he has found his heaven in their perpetual suffering. Child of the touched mind.
Perhaps I was not so smart. I stopped for mockingbirds, understood their chant of marking their space, and bowed to them. For this I was considered touched. The gods of imperfect creation blessed me with all their gifts, so those around me would whisper as I reveled in songbirds, shouted with joy at monarchs lighting on my shoulder. To correct this, these gods sent the yellow fever, and it took me in silence, no singing on the branches to welcome me to the 7 yards, my headless marker, the last remnant of the flawed construct which suffered pentimento of her creator.